Hello everyone. In this video, we will discuss about Azure Blobs. In the previous video, we have seen what are the storage services which are offered by Azure Cloud. Azure Blob is one of the storage services. Before going to the Azure Blob, say if I have a virtual machine, or for that matter, if I have the hardware, physical hardware, and if I wanted to install the operating system, first thing I need to have something called as file system. I need to have file system. Only then I'll be able to store any kind of files, right? So for Windows, it is NTFS. For Linux, it is ext3, ext4 or RiserFS. So in Azure Storage, I need to select something called as Azure Blob Storage Service. And if I selected Azure Blob Storage Service, I can store maximum amount of data. And this storage, this Azure Blob Storage can store unstructured data. So basically I need to create storage account in the first place. So once I create the storage account, I also need to create something called as container. So this container is similar to the Windows folder, but it is not a Windows folder. Once you create the container, you can store millions of objects within the container. So you can name the container as audio, video, document, image, Azure VHD files. So these are the container names, what you are going to create to store the binary large objects. So whatever data you are going to store in the Azure storage, it will be blob. This is unstructured data. So you can store maximum amount of data objects, which can be of anything like log files, audit logs, application logs, system logs, video files, documents, audio files, image files, in any format and any size. No need to manage the storage infrastructure. Azure will take care of the storage infrastructure. So we can do simultaneous multiple uploads to the blob storage, and blob storage are not limited to any particular file formats. And data is uploaded as blobs. Azure will take care of the physical storage needs. Let us see what are the use cases for blob storage. Blob storage can be used to serve images and documents via the browser. So we can access the blobs which are stored in the containers via the browser. And we can use the blob storage for storing files for distributed access by multiple users or multiple clients. We can also stream the audio and video files. Blob storage is also very useful when we wanted to use for backup and recovery purpose. Say for example, if I have a backup server in on-prem or in the cloud itself, and this is my backup server, which can be of Veeam, or it can be of Vault, it can be of Net Backup. I can actually use the storage container and point the storage container which I have created in Azure Cloud to take all my backups, right? I can take all my backups inside this storage, which is actually the blob storage. We can also use the blob storage for data analysis. If there is any audit log or any application logs which needs to be analyzed, we can store the log files into the blob storage. And how can we access the blob storage? We can access the blob storage from anywhere using the HTTP or HTTPS protocol. We can also use client libraries such as Ruby, PHP, Python, Node.js, Java, .NET to access the Azure Blob Storage. Also, we can use the inbuilt CLI tools, which is there in the Azure Cloud CLI, which is PowerShell and Azure CLI tool to access the blob storage. Blob storage TS. When you store the data in Azure blobs, so when you are storing the data in the Azure Blob Storage, so this is the blob storage. When you store the data, estimate how frequently you want to access the data. So these are the data which are coming from multiple sources. It can be log files, it can be any files, it can be any objects, video files, audio files, documents. You need to estimate how frequently you are going to access the data, because some data are accessed very frequently and some data are accessed infrequently. Based on the estimation how the data is accessed frequently, we can configure the lifecycle policy to move the data to different tiers. Either we can move it to cool tier, cold tier, or archive access tier based on the data access pattern. Some data which is not being accessed and idle, as the data ages, we need to balance the data with different access tier. We know that Azure provides multiple access tiers. We can move our data between the tiers. Let us see the access tier one by one. Hot access tier. For the data which is frequently accessed, it can be images, documents for your websites. This will be under hot access tier. Cool access tier. For the data which is infrequently accessed and stored for at least 30 days. Example, invoices. It can be air tickets or any movie tickets. These are the examples for the cool access tiers. Cold access tier. This tier is optimized for storing data which is infrequently accessed and stored for 90 days. If the data is stored for 90 days in cool access tier, we can actually configure the lifecycle policy and move the data to the cold access tier. Cold access tier. This tier is optimized for storing data which is infrequently accessed and stored for at least 90 days. Archive access tier. Use this archive access tier for the objects which are rarely accessed and stored for at least 180 days. Examples can be of long-term data backup and audit logs, which has to be stored for security reasons. Let me give an example for the access tier and see how it is going to work. In the traditional environment, we can take this example. If I have the backup server, now this is my backup server where I have configured backups for multiple clients. It can be 1,000 clients or it can be 20,000 clients. So all these clients are getting backed up. So we have 20,000 clients. So clients are nothing but the host or the service which needs to be backed up. So this can be of Windows, Linux. The backup server will take the backup from the production servers. So these are production servers. From these servers, the backup server is going to take the backup. So this backup server takes backup of all the production servers and it has to store somewhere. It has to store somewhere in the sense, I will have the policy created for the first 7 days of the backup which has been taken. Say if it is a weekly backup of Friday, which is full backup, then I wanted to store all the data, all the backup data on the disk. So this is going to my disk storage and it will be there till 7 days. Once the 7-day is completed, once the 7-day retention is completed, I need to move this data to another tier. This can be virtual tape library. So this is also a disk library, but it is not exactly like a disk how we can access from the disk, the latency is little bit higher when compared to the disk storage. So the VTL latency will be more when compared to the disk storage. So I'll keep all my data till 35 days. So this is another retention period on which I am going to use on VTL. Once 35 days is complete, I will move this data to the tape. So once I copy to the tape, then I can ship this tape to the offline. So this is exactly how the access tier is going to work in Azure. So this is the same scenario how we are going to use in the Azure Storage for different access tier. Say for example, these are different tiers. I have hot tier, I have cool tier, I have cold tier, and I have archive tier. The cost for storing the data into the hot tier, I need to pay the cost. Whereas for downloading from the hot tier, if I download the data from the hot tier, there is no cost. And the data which is being stored after 30 days, it can be moved to the cool tier. So this will have cost less compared to the hot tier. But whereas when you download the data, you need to pay some charges. You keep the data in the cool tier for 90 days. Then you move the data to the cold tier. So here you keep for 180 days. The cost for storing the data in the cold tier, it will be less compared to the cool tier. And when you access the data from the cold tier, when you download the data from the cold tier, you need to pay the cost. And after 180 days, you can move this data to the archive tier. Archive tier is very cheap. The cost per GB is very less, whereas you need to rehydrate the data if you wanted to access from the archive tier. You need to pay additional cost for accessing the data from the archive tier. So you can create the lifecycle policy. So this is the lifecycle policy which you are going to create. And these are the rules which you can define in the lifecycle policy. So you can define saying that after 30 days, I need to move to the cool tier. After 90 days, I need to move to the cold tier. And after 180 days, I need to move to the archive tier. If at all, if I wanted to move the data back from cool to hot, you can also create a rule saying that if the data has been accessed from the cool tier within 25 days, move it to the hot tier. Right? You can also define the policy similar to how you have defined to move the data from cool tier to the hot tier. You can also define the policy to move it back to the hot tier. You can actually have 100 rules in a lifecycle policy what you are going to configure. Once you define the lifecycle policy, and if the data is not being accessed for 180 days, those data can be moved to the archive tier. So you can actually change the numbers. The default numbers are 30, 90, and 180. You can actually keep the data in the archive tier for lifelong. Or you can have the retention, which is long-term retention. For 7 years or 10 years or even for lifelong. So what are the considerations of access tier hot and cool access tier can be set at the account level. The cold and archive access tier are not available at the account level. Hot, cool, cold, and archive tiers can be set at the individual blob levels. And data in the cool and cold access tier can tolerate slightly lower availability, but it requires high durability. The retrieval latency and throughput characteristics are similar to the hot data. Archive storage stores data offline and offers the lowest storage cost. So this archive tier, it has the lowest cost per GB, and when you want to access the data which are stored in archive tier, it needs to rehydrate the data so that we can access the data which is stored in the archive tier. So this was an overview about blob storage. Thank you for watching the video. If you like the content, please subscribe and share the video. Thank you and take care.